Without further ado, we'll get right into it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We are very happy to be joined by four of our Podchaser Pro clients that are in the nonprofit space. We will go around the room and make some introductions here shortly. But as part of planning this content and planning this programming around it, there's obviously so many things that are going on in the world today. Some of these things we were talking about even before we started our session here today. And we want to highlight a lot of the great work that's being done specifically on the human side in the nonprofit space. So, again, many thanks to our participants here today to talk about how they're using podcasts and how they're amplifying their messages through this very different, very special, very unique medium. So, we will start off if we just go around the room. Karl Vries, take it away. Quick intro and about fire.
Absolutely. Thanks, Trent, and thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. Yes, I'm Karl. I'm the Director of Media Relations for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. We're the nation's premier free speech group. We're based in Philadelphia. We have an office in Washington, D.C., where I'm speaking to you right now. What we try to do, we try to cultivate a culture of free speech across the United States. Much of our work is in college campuses, making sure that students, administrators, faculties, free speech rights are upheld. We do legal advocacy. Occasionally, we will take on clients across the nation, both at the college level, but also non-college as well. We also do plenty of advocacy as it relates to the federal government and legislative work as well. Pretty much anything and everything related to the First Amendment as it relates to free speech rights.
Awesome. Thanks, Karl. We'll pass the mic over to Morgan Kelly at Clean Slate, the Clean Slate Initiative, pardon.
Thanks, Trent. My name is Morgan Kelly. I'm a senior marketing and communications strategist with the Clean Slate Initiative. I am based in Maryland, as I mentioned before, and the Clean Slate Initiative is a national nonprofit that works to pass and implement automated record sealing laws. So that once a record becomes eligible, you take the petition process, which is costly, complicated, and can often take a lot of time, and it shifts it so that an eligible record is sealed automatically. So we are a newer organization. We've only been around for about 6 years, and but we're a mighty one, and we are fortunate enough to have partners all across the country doing this work with us. And we work at the federal level to pass clean slate legislation in Congress as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. Caitlin, Project on Government Oversight.
Hi, yeah, I'm Caitlin McNeil with the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. We're an independent, nonpartisan watchdog group that exposes and advocates for reform around corruption, abuse of power, and waste in the federal government. There's a lot of that going around, so we are very busy right now.
Thanks for carving out some time for us here today. And finally, last but not least, Seth Larson with World Wildlife Fund.
Yeah, thanks, Trent. I'm Seth Larson. I'm a director of media and external affairs at World Wildlife Fund. I also host our in-house podcast, Nature Breaking, and we are the world's largest conservation organization. We operate in over 100 countries, and we work to save the world's wildlife and the ecosystems they rely on. And I specifically work for WWF US, and we have colleagues all around the globe. So very happy to be here with you today.
Excellent. So we'll kick off with our first kind of discussion question, and that's going to be, how are you using podcasts today? And Caitlin, I want to start with you and Pogo because in some of the responses that we got leading up to the event, you guys have a little bit different of approach. You're doing podcasts from kind of two different angles. So Caitlin, how is Pogo using podcasts today?
Absolutely, yeah. So we are pitching our advocates and experts to make guest appearances on podcasts, sometimes in a rapid response manner to kind of insert ourselves into the news, or from more of a strategic perspective as we're pushing a particular reform or issue on Capitol Hill. And we also have our own in-house podcast. And we have an investigative newsroom. So our podcast, Bad Watchdog, is a narrative podcast got two seasons out that have, each a 6 episode arc. So it takes a very long time to produce this narrative podcast that we have.
Excellent. And Karl, you had a third dimension to podcasts, and I think we'd kind of define that as media monitoring. I know in your response to the question leading up to the event, you identified media monitoring as being something that the Fire's been able to leverage to advance certainly the guest appearance side. So, Karl, how's Fire leveraging podcasts?
That's right. Using Podchaser, it's such a valuable tool to flag mentions of fire in the podcast sphere. Obviously, listening to every single podcast would be a little bit beyond our capability. When we get references to fire on podcasts, it's a couple of things. One, first of all, the easy one. If somebody is misrepresenting our work or has a factual mistake, it's an opportunity for us to flag producers and say, hey, just to clarify, you actually had that wrong, or happy to talk through it. But the other one that's really interesting, Trent, and I think this is what we were discussing earlier, is when people reference fire, that's a perfect opportunity in my capacity as media relations to reach out to them and just say, hey, I heard you mentioned our work. That was really nice. Thanks so much. Part of what I try to do in this role is to develop personal relationships with as many people as I possibly can. And honestly, just opening up that line of communication, saying thanks for that. Would love to have someone on, or maybe from Fire. We could, you referenced our work. Would you like to have someone from Fire on to talk about whatever you want? As I mentioned earlier, we talk about an array of topics and issues that I think have wide appeal. And oftentimes that's been successful in us placing guests as well. So it's an opportunity for us to make sure that Fire's work is being accurately represented in the podcast sphere, but also a potential opportunity for us to place guests.
Love that. Thanks, Karl. And then Seth, I would say, in addition to what Caitlin and the POGO team are doing on the owned side of the podcast house, if you will, WWF maybe has one of the more evolved approaches to podcasts, certainly since you've introduced video into kind of this ecosystem as well. But Seth, tell us a little bit about how World Wildlife Fund is engaging with podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I sit on the media and external affairs team. And so my team is not only producing our in-house podcast, but we're also the folks who are in charge of making sure that we're being represented on external podcasts as well. And I think it's fair to say that we've really integrated podcasts as a core component of our external affairs strategy. And we really see podcasts as a go-to platform for long form interviews, especially, and like really in-depth storytelling. We really appreciate the level of nuance that podcasts allow our experts to get into, because our mission's pretty complicated. It sounds simple to just sit here and be like, yeah, we're working to save pandas and tigers, but the details of how that gets done are actually incredibly complicated. So we love that sort of long form leash that podcasts give us to tell our stories. And then, yeah, our in-house podcast, Nature Breaking, we launched it in 2022. It was initially an audio only podcast. We've added video over the last 2.5 years. And we've really seen that as an important tool for strengthening our brand and being able to deliver really timely and relevant content to some of our core supporters. So we're doing it from both sides, and we just see it as a really, really valuable place to be.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about some of the campaigns you guys have done. Obviously, we highlighted that on Podchaser social media a couple weeks ago with the integration between you and Pew Research or Pew Charitable Trust. So we'll get into a lot more of that later. But you did mention one word, and that's nuance. And Morgan, I know in your pre-survey response, you took a much more philosophical approach to answering this question. And one of the key words that you included was nuance. And as we see the chat kind of nodding their heads along and injecting some of their own perspective about nuance and its importance, how does nuance play, and how does these long form interviews play into what you guys are doing at Clean Slate?
Yeah, I think that the one of the strongest things about podcasts is that it does give you an opportunity to have a conversation and not a soundbite. And so for us, Clean Slate and record sealing in general, automated record sealing, like it's all a very complex issue. And so, but at the core of that issue are people. They're the people that are impacted by the barriers of having an arrest and conviction record. So being able to have a longer conversation on a podcast really allows us to pull people into that issue and understand the connection and the barriers and hear from the directly impacted people and go beyond awareness and like actually start to build some understanding.
Awesome. Now, moving into question two, there is a build versus borrow debate that happens within podcasts and generally speaking when it comes to owned and earned media. But I want to start with what made you decide to actually start a show? Seth, I know you referenced Nature Breaking came out a few years back now at this juncture, and you guys have survived what people in our industry call the pod fade, which is most folks don't really get past episode 6. But take us back to when you were first conceptualizing having an owned podcast. What went into that decision?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely an idea that it was bouncing around for a handful of years. I think it probably got delayed a little bit by the pandemic and all of that. But I think the core motivation was just the it's really the same motivation behind why you see organizations or companies putting blogs on their website. That's a slightly older, more established model, but there's always going to be stories that organizations need to tell to their supporters, to their customers, to explain the work they're doing and to just get across their point of view. And sometimes you're going to be able to leverage external media for that. We will always try to pitch our stories to, the New York Times of the world and trade publications and on down the line. But sometimes those stories just aren't the right fit for an external publication, and you need to have a platform where you can tell your own story in the way that you see fit. So blogs served that purpose for a long time. They still do for people who want to read a story. That's great. But a lot of people are just consuming their news on podcasts now, and they want to get this information while they're driving a car, while they're mowing the lawn on the weekend. And so that was really the motivation behind why we started a podcast, because we just felt like there was space where our supporters needed to hear from us and needed to understand the work we were doing, and we needed to be giving them that material in a way they wanted to consume.
Perfect. Now, Caitlin, you guys took a little bit of a different approach with Bad Watchdog. It's a different model. It's an investigative narrative, not necessarily an interview show. Why the narrative format versus just guest Q&A, bringing on celebrities or whoever? What drove the decision to go investigative narrative route?
Absolutely, yeah. So, corruption and abuse of power is really broad mandate, and it's also not particularly tangible. So we're always looking for ways to incorporate narrative storytelling. It's not easy in a soundbite or even in like a short, written article to really demonstrate how abuse of power at the highest echelons of government is trickling down and impacting people and communities across the country. And so because we have this investigative newsroom, we're able to take our time and create a really robust season where we can interview advocates, people on the ground, and weave that into a story that it kind of incorporates our reporting on abuse and corruption in the federal government to really help it resonate with folks, kind of like why corruption and abuse of power matters, as opposed to some of those kind of like bread and butter issues like the economy and the environment that people are talking about all the time.
That's great. And having an investigative newsroom certainly helps, kind of clears the runway, if you will. So that makes a ton of sense. Now, Karl, I know you guys have So to Speak. I guess how do we frame up how that decision to build that show was conducted?
Yeah, well, we've had, so to speak, it's actually celebrating this month or next month, May, its 10-year anniversary. And if you're interested in checking out the show, which is available at fine podcast retailers everywhere, we have a smattering of kind of more academic, intellectual guests who can talk about the history of free speech, the history of, we'll say, yellow journalism or what have you in the early 20th century, or free speech, history of free speech worldwide. We also can use it as a platform to respond to rapid news. I think our most recent episode that was recorded this week dealt with the aftermath of the James Comey indictment over the 8647 seashell incident, as well as the latest threat from the FCC against Disney owned and operated stations for early license renewals, This is in the wake, of course, of the Jimmy Kimmel joke about Melania Trump. So it's an opportunity for us to steer the conversation on our terms, have guests that we want to have. And again, we can have the bang bang news of this happened, fire is now rapidly responding to it, and being able to speak at length to the extent that we want to with our own podcast, to also having a little bit more, I'll say, thoughtful and a little bit more historical discussions as well as step backs on matters such as we refer to it as the global free speech recession, trends across the world, so on and so forth. I think as some of the others have mentioned, podcasts are an opportunity to have a little bit more of a nuanced discussion. Oftentimes we'll put some of these thoughts in the written word in blogs, but a lot of what we'll do is sometimes issue statements, and we try to keep them short and pithy. But the reality is, especially as it relates to free speech and First Amendment law, it's often very nuanced and can sometimes take the course of a conversation to say so. I think podcasts offer you a unique platform and medium to have those conversations that often are a little bit sensitive and kind of offer more opportunities for something smart to say.
Excellent. Now, moving the conversation a little bit more from the hypotheticals or some of the things that we've done into more of the impact. I want to start here with Seth, because Seth, you have three very clear, concrete stories of how podcasts have moved the needle when it comes to WWF. One was an executive hearing Nature Breaking, and that led to funding conversation. The New York Times with the Bison episode, U.S. News World Report. I'll let you fill in the gaps on the details, but you had some very clear wins, if you will, as it pertains to podcasts and WWF.
Yeah, I'll share those really quickly, and there's also actually a more recent one I'll share quickly as well. But I mean, basically, we love anecdotal evidence. I can look at the raw numbers for downloads and all that, and that's great, and see the number of subscribers we have. Those are great things to report out on. But a few cool things that have happened over the course of the time we've had this podcast were about a year ago, we did an episode explaining a new initiative that one of our teams here at WWF was launching, and it was an initiative that was conceptual and needed some funding and external support to really get it off the ground. And an executive at a company heard that episode organically, thought it sounded like a really cool initiative, and actually reached out to our team here that was leading it to strike up a conversation about whether they could get involved with a financial commitment to help get it off the ground. And those conversations are actually still ongoing. So to be determined how that plays out. But that was a really cool thing that, it just happened by us putting the episode out there. We also had a New York Times reporter reach out to us in response to an episode we did last summer on bison conservation in the Great Plains. And the reporter engaged with our team about brainstorming and the right opportunity to do sort of a long form piece in the Times about bison conservation. Again, to be determined how that shapes out, but really cool to have a reporter reaching out to us as a result of a podcast she heard. And similarly, a month or two ago, we did an episode about monarch butterflies, and that podcast was actually quoted in a story published by U.S. News and World Reports. We put out a press release and all sorts of other materials around this monarch butterfly news that we were talking about in the podcast. But for whatever reason, the podcast was the piece that reached that particular reporter and ended up in that story. So that was really cool to see. And then more recently, just this month, we featured an episode of our podcast promoting WWF's Give an Hour for Earth campaign, which is something we do every April. We ask all of our supporters to go out and donate 1 hour of their time to do something for the planet, whether it's picking up trash in your neighborhood or spending time in nature, or even just educating yourself by listening to a nature-focused podcast. And we set a goal for our organization of reaching 150,000 hours donated over the course of this month. And the commitments that have come through from that podcast episode are over 20,000 hours. So that's a really significant portion of the number of hours we're going to have towards our ultimate total this month. And that was something that was really cool to see.
That's amazing. Now, of those examples, those four you just laid out, which one surprised you the most?
Definitely the executive at an external company coming across an episode that we did and then reaching out to our team about becoming a potential funding partner. I mean, that's sort of the transformational momentum building and partnership building type of stuff that makes our organization go and that takes our work from an idea on a page to actually making a difference in a rainforest or a species population somewhere. So that was the most surprising and the most out of left field, and I think potentially the most impactful, depending on how that shakes out down the road.
Awesome. Now, Caitlin, Bad Watchdog has received many awards: gold at Signal, gold at Davie Awards, silver at the Anthem Awards, third at National Headliner Awards. Did any of these awards translate into anything tangible? Donor interest, talent recruiting, media inbound. I guess walk us through, getting those nice shiny medals and feeling really great about that, and then and turning it into real impact for the organization.
I wish I had something, beautifully tangible the way Seth just illustrated for you. But we actually did recently kind of rebrand our nonprofit newsroom as POGO Investigates, and are really looking to kind of expand our presence with and kind of bolster that sub-brand with new audiences, fellow journalists, with donors, and having those awards under our belt really, I think, demonstrate that we're serious players in the space, that we do, well, quality investigative reporting that's recognized by these outlets. So it's definitely going to be helpful down the road.
Love that. And then, Karl, I know you would reference this kind of in your opening salvo as well, but taking that monitoring alert, turning it into a real guest opportunity. What was that timeline like? It seemed like it was fairly compressed, but I'd love to hear what that actually lined up as.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was basically, I think, an op-ed that my colleagues published, and I think we sent them a quick note soon after it was mentioned on a show. Soon afterwards, we sent them, the producer, a quick note saying thank you so much. And then they said, like, well, when could we have one of your people on? And we're like, sure. I mean, what time works best for you? And I think we turned this around trend, I think soup to nuts, maybe within 2 weeks. I mean, from them mentioning it to finding a time for one of my colleagues to come on and just pop a quick show. So it doesn't necessarily have to take super long. One of the things that I find with podcasts, but I think the media really just in general, is obviously I have an agenda working with Fire. I want to get our name out there. We are trying to promote a culture of free speech, all that jazz. At the same time, as it relates to podcasts, their podcast producers and hosts are looking for something smart to say and to fill with their shows. It's not it's not really just a matter of me coming hat in hand to them and begging them to have my people on. It's really kind of a marriage of we both have, in a sense, similar interests, and how best can we kind of now help each other to do this. And I think when I communicate with hosts and producers, it's really a sense of like, all right, thinking to myself, what do I think they need, and what can I offer to them that I think is going to scratch that itch?
That's perfect. Now, Morgan, I know when we talk about some of these specifics, obviously, a lot of our panelists have some real bona fide kind of wins under their belt. But even if we were to back it up and say, maybe not specific moments, but generally speaking, what kind of momentum, as opposed to moment, but momentum is built through, on the impact side through podcasts for Clean Slate.
Yeah. I mean, Seth, Caitlin, Karl, you all have incredible experience in this space, and I am learning a lot so much hearing from you already. But Clean Slate Initiative is new to this space. This is our first year even having a podcast strategy. So we did a lot of work in building that podcast strategy in partnership with M&R, nonprofit comms firm that we work with, and with Podchaser as a tool. And now we're at the point where we are starting to enact that strategy. And some of the things we're looking at is, are we, of course, are we getting booked? Are we hitting target audiences? The most basic of things. But one of the things that we really want to use podcasts for this year, as we're building up kind of our footprint in the podcast world, is using our appearances to not only drive that public understanding, but kind of use it as like an asset that keeps giving back. So using the clips, the video clips, the audio clips from podcast appearances to reuse that content across our channels, across our platforms, to use it to get even more appearances booked. So creating like a sizzle reel for our CEO, Sheena Mead, who, once we get some new podcast appearances, we can put together a sizzle reel and say, hey, Sheena's really good at talking about this, and she'd be a great fit for your show, and here's why. So stuff like that are kind of where we're at now. And so we're not at that side of like, we don't have that. This podcast helped us accomplish this big goal yet. I hope it'll get there, but right now that's where we're at, and we're excited about this part of the work. It's been fun so far.
That's excellent. Now moving the conversation into the love-hate relationship we might have with measuring impact and communicating that to leadership, as Seth has discussed, and obviously everybody else within podcast land. Sure, we can look at things like downloads and reach and all of these fun metrics. But when we talk about podcast guest appearances, we talk about crossovers and these types of things. There's no spot within Google Analytics, and I've checked, believe me, that says referral source equals podcast guest appearance or podcast, right? So we now live in this kind of post-click attribution world in which people are watching reels, people are listening to long-form podcasts. There's not a spot where we can directly say X number of people click this link, and therefore we know what that impact had. I've got a whole other webinar topic of discussion when it talks about how maybe us as marketers, we as marketers have been technologists more so than marketers because we've relied on some of these analytics tools, whether it's Google or Facebook or Meta, generally speaking, to help us inform our leadership about the impact of what we're doing. But there's a lot of softer metrics that we look at. And Seth, I want to start with you here. When it comes to the measurable outcomes, yes, obviously we have the additional hits that were generated on traditional media. But what else? How are we bubbling up this conversation to leadership to help them understand what kind of impact we're actually making within the podcast space?
Yeah, so I guess I would break that down along two tracks. One with the internal podcast that I host, and also separately for the external podcasts that me and my media team colleagues are pitching and trying to get placements on. So for the internal podcast, yeah, I mean, I already shared some of those anecdotal stories, which are great. I would also add that our podcast has been a really good tool to showcase voices from the communities that we're working with. Like we did an episode with a teacher who is leading a program at a school participating in WWF's Food Waste Warriors program, which helps school cafeterias avoid food waste. And being able to feature that teacher and the work that she and her school are doing was really cool. And like that community really appreciated that and got excited about it. It's also been a great touch point for our corporate partners and other stakeholders who will periodically have on the show to talk about the work they're doing with us to advance sustainability in their supply chains. And those companies and those stakeholders really appreciate that opportunity to communicate with WWF's audience and tell their story, talk about why their companies care about sustainability and the environment. And we're kind of able to give them access to an audience they might not otherwise have. And those are like really important stewardship opportunities with those relationships that we value. For external podcasts, I would also just say that, I always tell our leadership, you have to think about the importance of building your brand. We focus a lot on building WWF's brand, which is super important, and that's never going to go away. But the individual brands of our leadership and experts are really valuable to us too. For early or mid-career experts, podcast appearances provide really invaluable opportunities to practice their pitch and to like really hone in on how they want to talk about the work they're doing. And for our more senior leaders who are more established and who kind of already know what they want to say about that sort of stuff, I think it's really valuable to showcase the human side of a big organization like WWF and just show that there are people here who care about our mission and they can talk about why and where that comes from. And that's ultimately going to build trust and contribute to the long-term stewardship of our brand as well.
That's excellent. I like to view it as increasing the surface area of luck, right? And obviously, you've identified that through some of the anecdotes of landing additional coverage. But the more activators you have out in media channels, generally speaking, obviously it's going to raise the tide of all the boats that are involved within the organization.
Yep.
So I love that. Karl, I know you specifically mentioned the measurement problem, and I appreciate the candor that you had in your pre-show survey. Measurement's hard, and it's okay to say so, but you did identify that you often hear from donors that they heard of Fire's work through the podcast ecosystem. I guess walk me through that. How do we know this? Is that direct conversations with donors? Is that heard through the grapevine, social monitoring? To talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's probably a couple of different things. I think one would be the anecdotal, which is obviously, again, it's difficult to quantify and it's difficult to bottle and to mass produce. But we do hear a lot from donors who say, "Hey, I heard, our president and CEO, Greg Lukianoff, will say on a podcast recently, there's a bit of a, we'll call it heterodox space as it relates to podcasts." And I'm thinking of popular podcasts such as ones produced by Reason, Fifth Column, Free Press, sites like that. So I think oftentimes you'll hear we sometimes will make the rounds as it relates to those shows, and oftentimes our donors who might be listening to perhaps not our work directly, but listening to one of those shows, hear of us, and then they understand that we're the free speech people, and that well, that helps with the donations. The other thing also is impressions, as it relates to if we know people are. I think another strategy we can kind of do is if we know if people are listening to a certain podcast, we can at least perhaps advertise on that podcast, we'll say on Monday. And on Tuesday, we might put at least Fire into the bloodstream, put it into your head that you've heard of Fire. And then on Tuesday, perhaps do targeted digital advertising in the spaces where you might be likely to see it. And then we'll sometimes get donations that way as well. And of course, you can also have a more concrete way of measuring it if people donate through a podcast description link that's right there. So I think there are a few ways of measuring it. But I do think having kind of that nice marriage of making sure that our voice is out there in the spaces that we know we're meeting people, and then also making sure that we're following through with concrete opportunities to donate and to deliver action. I think that's been successful for us.
That's great. Now, Caitlin, I know when you probably set out to start the podcast, you didn't necessarily say, "Hey, here's our guiding principles or our guiding metrics. We're going to go out and win 4 awards." So as that did happen, as that evolved, how are you rethinking measurement? How are you rethinking what success looks like within in podcast land for POGO?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our own podcast, obviously, the awards are great and we've had a lot of success there. And I think now we're really focusing on how do we boost our listenership? Um, how do we tighten our workflow a little bit so that we can put seasons out a little bit more frequently to help us kind of with that momentum of getting the reach that we're really looking for. In terms of guest appearances, it is tricky to measure. You have no idea how many people have actually listened to that podcast on a given day. But what's great about Podchaser is that we get that understanding of demographics of who are the type of people who are listening to that show, which I just find to be super valuable. Because you know kind of the type of audience that is listening to that show. And so maybe I don't have a number, to demonstrate the impact of an appearance on a podcast, but I can say, hey, we're reaching this type of audience that we think is either really primed to kind of act in our issue area or who we aren't really reaching, and we want to educate a little bit about our work. And it does take a little bit of kind of like educating and saying over and over again to leadership that, yeah, this isn't going to be tangible, but those random donations to our website that seem to come from nowhere, like, did they, they may have seen us in a print article, they may have heard us on a podcast, and, folks often need several touch points before they act on something, before they decide to donate, to sign up for email, to take an action. And you're just increasing those touch points with folks, the more types of media and appearances you get.
Perfect. Now, Morgan, my assumption is that a lot of folks in the audience right now, and those that are working in podcasts or just getting started out with podcasts, are in a very similar boat to you. You're building the plane as you're flying. You're establishing this podcast strategy. Maybe to frame that for that type of audience, what are some things that you guys have built into kind of your podcast strategy that are going to allow for maybe not today, but into the future, being able to report back to leadership on some of these impact moments?
Yeah, I think that what I mentioned before about the generating the content from podcast appearances, that's a really easily measured metric there. Like, do we have content that we're able to reuse from podcasts? So that's one thing. And then in the future, as we do start getting more podcast appearances, my argument to leadership to keep this effort going will be a lot of what Seth and Caitlin and Karl just talked about, that input or inbound interest. Like, are we getting more media appearances from this? Are we having partners reach out to us and say, hey, that was a great episode. Have you heard about this other podcast? That would be really cool to have a conversation on. Are we seeing website traffic spikes tied to those episodes? So a lot of that, yeah, I think I echo the fact that it's harder to measure than some other things, but it's definitely the bigger picture, and that's part of our strategy is understanding that this is kind of a longer haul, bigger picture type of strategy, and so we're not going to always have the most dialed in KPOs for it.
Perfect. Now, moving the conversation a little bit more from the strategy side to the tactical side, I want to talk about workflows. So, what does it look like when you are getting someone booked? And that can range from identifying who the quote unquote talent is going to be representing the organization, to finding the shows that are going to be a good fit, to getting them prepared for the interview, to the actual email that you send as a pitch to a producer or to a host. And I actually want to start here with Karl, because I think you have the most kind of concrete examples of this from what we saw in the pre-show survey. So, Karl, tactically speaking, how do you line up your internal workflow for getting thought leaders from Fire onto podcasts?
How the secret sauce is made. Well, first of all, as you know, it's not exact science. I'd love to say that I have the Midas touch over here. Obviously, you have your hits, you have your misses. I think podcasts are somewhat unique in that if I have a statement and I'm sending it out to the press on FCC and Comey this week, we'll say, that's kind of easy for me to do. I can do a blast. Here's a statement. Reporters can take it, they can incorporate it into their story, their print story, put it out there, easy. Podcast guests can be a little bit, that's trickier to do. And podcasts, at least I found, it's not a matter of so and so just taking a piece of paper or just reading a statement as they're doing the news or what have you. It doesn't, for us, it hasn't really worked that way. I think it's a few things, and Trent, I think you touched on this actually in your introduction here. We have to do some research on the show itself. Is this the right fit for us? What kind of work do they do? What kind of conversations do they like to have? Now, Fire, we are nonpartisan. We talk to everybody across the ideological spectrum, and including we're willing and do have sometimes combative exchanges with people. We're willing to have those difficult conversations as well. So we're willing to work with almost anybody, but we do have to make sure that we know what they're looking for so I can tailor my pitch to it. I find a mechanical, dry, here, have a fire staffer on your show, that doesn't connect with people. And that makes sense. We need to have hey, listen, we know that you've been talking about XYZ. I have the person who can have those conversations with you. If I'm talking to a producer, I know your host is interested in these issues. I got the perfect person who's right here. They got a ton of media experience. They can have that. And going back to what I was saying earlier, in so many words, they have a need to have fascinating, interesting, grabby conversations. I have the people who can make those conversations happen. That takes time. It takes a little bit more of that tailored personal pitch. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 emails just to make sure they see it. Everybody's busy. I get it. sometimes you can just kind of ignore an email. I get that too. Sometimes it's, hey, making sure you saw. What I do is if I'm doing publicity for a colleague's book, or if I'm really, well, I think really with any podcast pitch I do, I keep a spreadsheet. When was the last time I reached out to a person? Who are the producers that I reached out to? Who's the person that Podchaser is listing as a top person there with booking or production to target? If I ping them, we'll say, sometimes it might be 7 days, 10 days. There's not an exact science to it. I certainly don't want to be pestering them. I don't want to be nagging them. I don't want them to think to themselves, that these people are spamming me and now I'm going to block them. But trying to find that happy medium of being on them, hey, making sure you saw my note, or if maybe it's a really hot target that I want to place a fire staffer on. Hey, it's been a couple weeks since I last checked in. Fire's been up to A, B, and C. We've been doing all these great things. It's still a perfect time to have our guest on. Hope to hear from you. Having that persistence, having that personal pitch to them, and again, in a perfect world, having a personal relationship as best I can with producers, I find is more successful than having a mechanical mass email send that I find often gets ignored.
Perfect. And Morgan, with Clean Slate, again, I think you're in a very unique position that you represent a lot of folks that are in the audience today, just getting their podcast program off the ground. How are you identifying good fit opportunities? How are you approaching outreach? How are you approaching guest selection when it comes to earned media appearances?
Yeah, getting pretty tactical because I think that that information might be beneficial. We are using Podchaser to monitor where things like criminal justice reform are popping up in podcast world. Where are other executive leaders in ally organizations popping up? Where are they having conversations and things like that? So definitely using monitoring tools like that. Our partners at M&R also help us do some of that research, which is great for a nonprofit with limited capacity. And then I echo Karl's statements 1000%. Do not send mass pitches. That's been drilled into me, and I will drill it back out. I think that, especially what I've found in so far in this podcast work is that you do have to be mega tailored. You're not sending a press release. You are really trying to help the host or producer understand why you'd be a benefit to their show. And so definitely drafting tailored pitches and sending them out individually. And then once we do actually get a booking, the other piece that's really important for our workflow is spokesperson prep. You can have the best speaker on your staff, but if you're not prepping them for the audience they'll be talking to and the framing that and messaging that you want them to stay aligned with for that episode, then it could go off track pretty quickly. So that's another really important part for our process.
Excellent. We're going to do one last question here because I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A towards the end. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties on my end that has made us truncate this a little bit. But looking ahead, we'll go around the room. Each of you will have a chance to answer. Where do you see podcasts fitting into your organization strategy moving forward? We'll start with Seth and then move into Caitlin, Morgan, and then finishing off with Karl. So Seth?
Yeah, thanks, Trent. So, I mean, big picture, we increasingly see podcasts as part of really the same media ecosystem as legacy print or broadcast. I mean, I think you really need to put podcasts at the same table. They've earned that seat at the table at this point. And some podcasts have huge audiences that cross a whole range of demographics. Others have more niche audiences that they're going to bring with them. But it's pretty clear to me that podcasts are here to stay. And I think organizations need to be deliberate and thoughtful about incorporating them into their overall communications plans and really seeing them as equally important to those other sort of more traditional media outlets that you think of when it comes to media relations.
Excellent. Quick follow-up on that, Seth. With the rise of simulcast and video, are you now treating like video podcast opportunities in the same way you would have studio opportunities, whether it's a regional outlet or a national outlet? Has it quite risen to that level yet, or are we still a couple steps away from there?
I think yes, but you're conscious that you're reaching different audiences. When you think of like a traditional CNN hit, let's say, you're reaching a very broad general audience that whoever's tuning into their TV at that time of day, with a pre-recorded video, whether it's a podcast or just a YouTube show. Those shows they've cultivated their own audiences with their own tone and things they care about. And you're going to be just reaching people who have a different, or a very specific style and approach and things they care about. So I think you have to have that mindset and adapt to it going into it and not treat it necessarily as exactly the same thing. But I think a lot of the same lessons apply to both.
Excellent. Caitlin, grand vision for podcast moving forward with POGO?
Um, yeah, I think they'll continue to be important, and we'll kind of be continuing to level up our strategy with our own in-house podcast. I think we're just really looking to get out our third season, hopefully in early 2027, and look for ways to get a little bit less time in between seasons. One of the lessons I've learned in podcasting is just how much goes into that. It's not an easy thing to get started at your organization. Um, and yeah, they're incredibly important for our issue area. Talking about corruption and abuse of power brings up some really wonky, complex topics, and going on podcasts and being able to do long form interviews gives my colleagues the time and the space that they need to really bring people into the fold, and communicate why the work of our organization matters so much. So just kind of continuing to do what we're doing, I think.
Excellent. Morgan, I know you've already talked a little bit about this, whether it's doubling down on the social assets or repurposing off of guest appearances, but where do you see Clean Slate moving within the podcast world?
Yeah, I think big vision here. I hope to see us building those relationships like Karl was talking about with podcasts that are across tiers, the niche ones up to the top tier ones, and then making sure that podcasts are just an evolution of our traditional earned media efforts, not a separate thing. Be treating it as part of the same overall strategy, or part of the overall strategy. And I also really hope that we get to a point where we have enough of a podcast foundation as an organization that we can really leverage that to uplift the directly impacted voices of the people that we work with, because they're at the core of this movement. And I think that those are the storytellers whose voices need to be heard most. And that's pretty integral to the work we do in all of other aspects of our organization. So I want to get the podcast work there too.
Excellent. And Karl, closing us out.
There's a useful quote by the American jurist Learned Hand. When liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no law, no court, no constitution can save it. Part of what we do at Fire, as I mentioned at the outset, is we try to cultivate as best we can in this country a culture of free speech. Wherever we can find people to share that message with, we're going to explore it. Podcast sphere is obviously quite a fertile ground for us to do that with. And as I think everyone on this call has said, it's an opportunity to have, again, longer form, more thoughtful discussions, often about sensitive, complicated, challenging topics. I forgot to mention, we also do research at Fire. That's stiff. Sometimes that can be dry and stiff to kind of talk about, to put out in a press release. A podcast, you can say, all right, well, listen, here's some numbers. Okay. But this is really the stories behind them. I think Caitlin was talking about the advantage of being able to breathe some narrative into this, some human element into it. Podcasts are a perfect vehicle for that. And as it relates to where I see us going forward from here, as I said, anyone, anywhere where we can get where we can reach people. We want to be exploring and we want to be on that. Um, I think it's an exciting medium, and we've gotten quite a bit of success in reaching people through it so far.
Excellent. Now moving into Q&A, and I believe this is pronounced Mary Jane. What are the ways that you promote podcast appearances in advance to your target audience? Does anyone have a strong opinion on that? Pre-priming your target audience for an upcoming guest appearance? Or recently published one that might change the answer slightly. Go ahead, Karl.
Well, I'm just trying to think through it here. The ways that you promote podcast appearances in advance to your target audience. I do think I do think it can be helpful to probably mention on social if we have a big appearance. It's just flag that we're going to be appearing on show XYZ. I don't know if that answers the question. I do think that oftentimes we'll try and use that if we have the right appearance.
Good. And any other takers on that one, Seth?
I think Morgan had her,
Oh,
it looked
Morgan.
looked
Sorry,
like
go
he
ahead,
just came
Morgan.
off.
Yeah, thank you. I I just want to say here that maybe this isn't the right approach, but this is what I think has we've done so far and might continue to do. Maybe with a bigger appearance, it would be different, but I usually want to hear the podcast episode myself before we're promoting it widely. So, and podcasts live forever. So I think that for us, it is a promote after the fact. And if it was a good episode, promote it well.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, Morgan. I think when there's always going to be exceptions to this, there will be places where it makes sense to promote in advance. But I think largely when you're doing those promotions, you want people to be able to click the link and take the action when they see the post. And if you're telling them, keep this in mind for tomorrow, they might forget about it by then. So I guess the one place that we do make an exception for our podcast is we utilize YouTube's premiere function, which is it basically when you launch an episode, it runs as if it's like a live show for the duration of that one episode, and then it's available as a regular YouTube episode afterwards. We will use the YouTube community post function to let our audience know that, hey, an episode's going to be premiering in 2 hours. Tune in to just kind of get people into that initial premiere. But then the vast majority of our social promotion happens after the fact.
Excellent. Actually, I think that dovetails pretty nicely with the question Rob had. So, how has the growing embrace of video by podcasting channels affected your operations and channel strategy? Seth, you just laid out leveraging some of the native tools within YouTube specifically for that. Any others? Short form video platforms, TikTok, Instagram Reels. Any other thoughts about video?
I think that I could go on for a long time about that. I think the big thing for me has been trying to make sure that we don't cannibalize the underlying audio product while we're adding a lot of visual thoughts and touches to the episodes we're producing. But trying to be mindful of some of the best practices that are coming in to the video space. So, being really intentional about like the first 30 seconds of your video and what you're showing people, and making sure that there's something not only through the audio and what we're saying, but through the visuals and what we're showing people that can really grab people's attention and hopefully convince them to stay with the episode. And also just being thoughtful about what's going to be the best 1 minute segment that you can pull out of an episode to share with audiences on Instagram and other platforms. Video just gives you a lot more to work with versus a strictly audio product. It can almost be overwhelming, and you can drive yourself crazy sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. One last question that was asked anonymously and privately. What's one thing I can do as a communications person in a nonprofit organization that I can do in the month of May to set the stage for a larger podcast push? We'll do quick rapid fire, starting with Morgan. What's one thing that a nascent stage podcast individual or podcast curious individual can do?
Sure. Start your research this month. Find out what podcasts align with your work, and then from there you can start developing pitches.
Love it. Caitlin?
Yeah, I would say choose one person at your organization that you want to get on podcast. Think about exactly where they fit and prep them and their talking points for an appearance on podcast, and then you can build from there.
Seth?
I would say talk to your membership or your donor outreach division and ask if they can reach out to the donors and the members that they communicate with. Ask them what podcasts they listen to, and then use that as a starting point to think about which shows you should be pitching so that you're getting your message in front of the people who care about it the most.
Textbook audience development. Love that. And Karl?
I think just researching who the right decision makers are at the podcasts, and just kind of as making sure that you're hitting the right people.
Excellent. Well, that will conclude today's session. We are just 1 minute over, so thank you everybody for sticking with us through the technical difficulties at the top. I want to give a big round of applause to all of our panelists, Morgan, Caitlin, Seth, Karl, working on mission-driven organizations that range a wide span of disciplines and sectors. So thank you all for participating. This obviously was recorded. The recording will go out probably tomorrow, and then everybody who is in attendance will get access to this. It'll also live on our YouTube channel thereafter. But again, thank you so much, guys, for joining us here today. We appreciate your patronage. We appreciate your time. And I know some of us are going to be super busy with all the things that are happening in the world today and every day. So, any other questions for any of our panelists or participants? You guys okay having folks reach out to you personally?
Yeah, please do.
Awesome. And please make sure you take a look at their podcasts. Obviously, a ton of blood, sweat, and tears go into all of this work as identified by everyone here. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and best of luck in the podcast ecosystem.
Thanks, Trent.
Thanks, guys.